The wind howled across the empty plains of Montana Territory, rattling the windows of Elias Ward's ranch house like a restless spirit. For 10 long years, Elias had lived out here alone, a man of few words and fewer visitors. His cattle grazed on the wide stretch of Bitterroot Valley, his only company an aging dog named Bramble, and the faint sound of the wind sighing through the pines. The winters were cruel, and the summers lonelier still. So when the stagecoach dropped off a letter that morning, a letter written in neat, feminine handwriting and scented faintly of lavender, it felt almost like a miracle. Elias hadn't received a personal letter in years. The envelope bore the seal of a mail-order bride agency from St. Louis, one of those organizations that matched frontier men with women seeking a new start. The letter was from Miss Clara Whitmore, a 25-year-old woman describing herself as educated enough to read and cook, but humble enough to learn the ways of a ranch. Her words were graceful, but laced with melancholy. She wrote of loss, of wanting to escape the noise and corruption of the city, and of dreaming about a place where silence is not loneliness, but peace. Elias read the letter 3 times before setting it down beside his coffee mug. Her final lines struck him deepest. I do not seek wealth, only safety. I do not seek love, only honesty. If you are a man who keeps his word, I believe we could build a life worth keeping. Something about those words felt like a quiet plea, a voice reaching out across miles of wilderness straight into his chest. Elias wasn't a man given to hope. The frontier had burned most of that out of him. But this letter stirred something long dormant. He sat by the fire that night, weighing the risk. He'd heard stories of women who came west with false names, of men who paid for wives that never arrived. But there was something in Clara's tone, a mix of fear and sincerity, that didn't feel like deceit. He imagined her sitting by candlelight, pen trembling as she wrote. Running from shadows, she had said in one vague line. What kind of shadows haunted her? By morning, Elias had made up his mind. He wrote back in his rough, straightforward way. Miss Whitmore, if you truly wish for a new start, my home is open to you. It's a hard life here, but an honest one. Enclosed is fare for your train to Montana. I'll meet you myself when you arrive. He sealed the envelope with calloused fingers, feeling strangely nervous, almost foolish. Before noon, he rode into town and handed it to the postmaster with a curt nod. For days afterward, he found himself thinking of her, what her voice might sound like, what kind of person she was beneath those careful words. At night, he'd step onto the porch, listening to the distant coyotes, and wonder if she was truly coming, or if he'd just sent his heart into the wind. 3 weeks later, another letter arrived. This one was shorter, hurried, the handwriting uneven. Mr. Ward, I have accepted your offer. I am leaving St. Louis at once. Thank you for trusting me when others would not. Yours, Clara Whitmore. Elias folded the letter slowly, his pulse quickening in a way he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know it yet, but the woman on that train was not just a bride seeking peace. She was a fugitive, carrying secrets that could get them both killed. As the sun sank behind the Bitterroot Mountains, Elias looked toward the horizon and whispered to himself, Guess we'll see what kind of trouble this letter brings. In that quiet moment, beneath a sky turning blood red with sunset, the life of a lonely rancher began to change forever. The train whistled like a wounded animal as it screeched into the dusty station of Bitterroot Crossing, a tiny settlement barely clinging to the edge of the Montana wilderness. The air smelled of smoke, sagebrush, and iron. There were only 3 buildings worth mentioning, a saloon, a telegraph office, and a general store. Beyond that stretched miles of open prairie, and further still, the shadowed ridges of the Bitterroot Mountains where Elias Ward's ranch lay hidden among the pines. Elias waited on the platform, boots coated in trail dust, hat pulled low against the sun. He hadn't been this anxious since his father's funeral, though he'd never have admitted it. His rough hands fiddled with his coat buttons as the passengers stepped down one by one. Merchants, travelers, soldiers, all strangers. Then, through the hiss of steam, he saw her. Clara Whitmore. She was not at all what he'd expected. Not the fragile city flower he had imagined, nor the weary widow so many mail-order brides turned out to be. She stood tall, straight-backed, her chin lifted with quiet resolve. Her dress was plain and practical, but her gloves and the way she held herself spoke of a woman who once lived among refinement. Still, her beauty wasn't polished. It was something raw, alive, almost trembling with defiance. Clara carried only one small suitcase and a folded coat over her arm. When her eyes met Elias's, there was a flicker of recognition and something else. Fear. Not of him, but of something unseen. Her gaze darted down the empty road leading west. "Mr. Ward?" she asked, her voice soft but guarded. "That'd be me," Elias replied, removing his hat politely. "Welcome to Bitterroot Crossing, Miss Whitmore." Her lips curved into a faint smile, though her knuckles whitened on the handle of her case. "Thank you. If it's all right, I'd like to leave town immediately." Elias frowned. "You sure? It's a long ride to the ranch. Storm's brewing, too." "I can't stay here," she said quickly, glancing around the platform as if expecting someone to appear out of the shadows. "I'd feel better once we're away from town." He noticed then how her dress seemed slightly too loose, as though she'd lost weight recently. And beneath the folds of her coat, something was strapped against her ribs, the faint outline of a small revolver. She saw him notice and stiffened. "A woman can't be too careful," she murmured. Elias gave a short nod. "Fair enough. Let's get going, then." They mounted his wagon and started west, leaving behind the safety of civilization and entering the wild sweep of open land. The first few miles passed in silence. Elias stole glances at her now and then, her face pale, eyes distant, lips pressed tight, as if she were swallowing down something heavy. When he tried to make small talk, she answered politely but never offered more than a few words. She asked about the ranch, the winters, and whether anyone else lived there. When he told her it was just him and Bramble, she seemed to relax for a moment. Then her shoulders tensed again as though alone wasn't a comfort but a warning. As the sun dipped low, Elias decided they'd camp for the night by the edge of a canyon, where the water from a spring ran cold and clear. He built a small fire while Clara sat silently beside her suitcase, staring into the darkening horizon. Every so often, she would startle at the call of a coyote or the snap of a branch. When the fire burned low, Elias offered her a blanket. Their hands brushed for a moment, and he felt how cold she was. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked softly. Clara looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. There was something haunted there, something that made his chest tighten. Then she whispered, almost too quietly to hear, "We're alone now. Time to do what's necessary." Elias froze, unsure what she meant. But before he could speak, she reached beneath her coat and pulled out the revolver. The firelight gleamed on the metal as she turned toward the dark canyon beyond them, not aiming at him but at something out there. "They'll come for me," she murmured, "and they'll kill anyone in their way." The night air grew colder, and for the first time Elias realized this woman, his bride-to-be, hadn't just come to start a new life. She'd come to hide from death itself. The fire crackled low, sending sparks into the cold Montana night. Elias Ward sat motionless across from Clara, the flame's light flickering against her pale face. She held the revolver steady, her hand trembling ever so slightly, her eyes locked on the darkness beyond their small camp. The canyon around them was silent, too silent. Even the coyotes had stopped howling. Elias's instincts, honed by years of ranch life and frontier danger, told him one thing. This wasn't a nervous city woman's imagination. Something, or someone, was indeed out there. "Miss Whitmore," he said in a low voice, keeping his tone calm, "mind telling me who exactly we're expecting?" Clara's gaze didn't waver. She swallowed hard before whispering, "You wouldn't believe me if I told you." "Try me," Elias replied, his eyes narrowing as he reached for his own rifle lying beside the fire. For a long moment, she said nothing. The only sound was the wind sighing through the canyon stones. Then, As if the words were tearing themselves from her throat, Clara spoke. "I wasn't born a Whitmore," she began. "That's not my name. It's the one I took when I ran." Elias's grip on his rifle tightened. He said nothing, letting her continue. "My real name is Clara Vaughn. I lived in St. Louis. My father owned a shipping company, not wealthy but respectable. 3 years ago, he went into business with a man named Gideon Black. Charming. Handsome. Too good to be true." Her eyes grew distant, as if she were watching memories she wished she could burn. "They courted me for months," she said softly. "Everyone said he was the kind of man any woman would be lucky to marry. I believed them, but Gideon wasn't what he seemed. He wasn't a businessman at all. He was the leader of a smuggling ring that used my father's company to move stolen goods. When my father discovered it, he threatened to go to the law. 2 days later, he was found dead in his office. They said it was a robbery. But I knew." Clara's voice cracked, and she lowered the revolver slightly. The firelight glinted off tears she didn't bother to hide. "I ran that night," she whispered. "But before I did, I took something from Gideon, something he'd killed to get back. A little black ledger full of names, dates, and payoffs. Proof of everything. I mailed it to myself at your ranch before leaving St. Louis. I thought it would be safe there. I thought I could disappear." Elias felt the cold weight of her words settle between them. He had invited a stranger into his life, a woman who carried the kind of secret that drew blood and fire wherever it went. "You're saying men are after you?" he asked. She nodded. "Gideon's men. They've been tracking me for weeks. I saw them in Chicago. Then again in Billings. They'll follow me until I'm dead or until they have that ledger." Elias studied her for a long moment. This woman who had lied to him, yet trembled not from guilt, but from exhaustion and fear. He could have sent her away right then. She'd brought danger straight to his doorstep. But something in her eyes, and that desperate mix of shame and courage, struck him deeply. He took a slow breath. "You're safe here tonight," he said finally. "I'll keep watch." Clara looked at him as though she couldn't believe it. "You'd help me, even after all I've done?" Elias gave a faint shrug. "You ran from evil, not toward it. That counts for something." For the first time, she smiled, a fragile, flickering thing, gone almost as soon as it appeared. Together they sat in silence, the night stretching endlessly around them. Then, from somewhere beyond the canyon's rim, came the faint sound of hoofbeats, slow, deliberate, getting closer. Clara's face went pale. She gripped her revolver again, whispering the words that had started this all. "We're alone now. Time to do what's necessary." Elias rose to his feet, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the darkness. Somewhere out there, danger was coming, and the quiet life he once knew had just vanished into the cold Montana wind. The first streaks of dawn crept over the jagged horizon, staining the canyon walls gold and crimson. Elias Ward sat by the dying embers of the campfire, his rifle across his knees. He hadn't slept a minute. Every creak of wood, every flutter of the wind through the sagebrush had kept him alert. Beside him, Clara Vaughn, no longer Miss Whitmore, sat wrapped in her blanket, eyes red from a sleepless night. The revolver still lay within her reach. The faint hoofbeats they'd heard hours before had faded into silence. But both knew what that meant. The men following her were out there somewhere, watching, waiting. Elias finally broke the stillness. "We'll need to move soon," he said. "The ranch is another half-day's ride west. You can rest proper there." Clara nodded but said nothing. She looked like someone caught between running and surrendering. Elias studied her carefully, the way her hands trembled when she poured coffee, the way her eyes darted to the ridge lines as if expecting a ghost. When the fire was out and their horses were saddled, Clara finally spoke, her voice rough from fear and fatigue. "You must think me a fool," she said quietly. "Coming here under a false name, dragging danger to your doorstep." Elias adjusted the cinch on his horse, shaking his head. "No, I think you did what you had to do to stay alive," she smiled faintly. "That's what my father used to say, only he didn't get the chance to prove it." Her words opened a wound that hadn't healed. As they rode, Clara began to tell him everything she hadn't said the night before. Every piece of her tragic past that had driven her into the wilderness. Her father, Henry Vaughn, had been a decent man, fair, honest, and proud of his shipping business on the Missouri River. When Gideon Black came along, he'd seemed like the perfect partner, charming, ambitious, and connected. But within months, things changed. Large sums of money began to disappear. Late-night shipments left the docks without proper records. Henry confronted Gideon, threatening to expose him. That was when the first threats began. Notes slipped under their door. A dead raven left on the porch. Then one night, Henry never came home. The police called it a robbery gone wrong, but Clara had seen the truth in Gideon's eyes at the funeral. Satisfaction, not grief. 2 days later, she broke into Gideon's study. Inside, she found the black ledger he kept locked in a drawer, a book filled with names of corrupt officials, outlaws, and businessmen tied to his criminal network. She knew if she could get it to the law, Gideon would hang. But before she could flee, his men returned. "I barely escaped with my life," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I ran until I couldn't breathe. I mailed the ledger to myself, to your ranch, under the name Whitmore, hoping they'd lose the trail. But Gideon's men, they never stopped following." Elias felt a heaviness settle in his chest. He'd lived his whole life trying to avoid the chaos of the world, wars, politics, lawmen, and outlaws alike. And now, through a twist of fate, danger had ridden right up to his door wearing a woman's sorrowful eyes. Still, something in her courage stirred him deeply. She had lost everything, yet here she was, crossing a continent, facing death with a trembling but steady heart. "You got that ledger coming to my place through the mail?" Elias asked. She nodded. "It should arrive within the week. If we can get it, Gideon's finished. But until then..." She trailed off, eyes scanning the ridges again. "He'll keep hunting me. He won't stop." Elias looked toward the horizon, where the rising sun met the wild country beyond. "Then he'll find I'm not the kind of man who scares easy," he said quietly. Clara turned toward him, surprise flickering in her expression. "You'd help me, truly?" Elias met her gaze. "You're under my roof now, or you will be soon enough. And that makes your fight mine." The words seemed to break something inside her, the barrier she'd built between trust and survival. A single tear slid down her cheek, but she smiled faintly. As they rode on toward the Bitterroot Valley, the wind carried with it the echo of a promise neither fully understood yet, that the past might chase them, but together they'd face whatever came out of those shadows. Unbeknownst to them both, far behind in the canyon, 3 riders watched their retreating figures through a haze of dust, and one of them, with a scar over his left eye, smiled. "Found you," he muttered. "And this time there's no running." By the time Elias Ward and Clara Vaughn reached the Bitterroot Valley, the sun was sinking behind the mountains, painting the horizon in a wash of amber and violet. The long ride had left both exhausted, yet neither dared to slow. The air grew colder as they descended into the basin, where Elias's ranch sprawled across the plain like a solitary island amid the wilderness. The sight of the ranch should have brought comfort. The weathered barn, the corral, the small cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. But as soon as Elias saw the tracks in the dirt near the gate, his pulse quickened. Someone had been there. The hoof prints were fresh, too fresh. He dismounted slowly, his rifle ready. "Stay behind me," he murmured to Clara. She obeyed without question, her face pale beneath her bonnet. Together they moved quietly across the yard, the only sound the creak of the windmill turning lazily in the fading light. When Elias pushed open the barn door, Bramble, his old cattle dog, bounded out, tail wagging and nose pressed against his master's hand. Relief flickered briefly, but then Elias noticed the dog's hackles rising, a low growl rumbling in its throat as it stared toward the line of cottonwoods beyond the corral. "Someone's been watching the place," Elias muttered. "They didn't come to steal cattle either." Clara swallowed hard, glancing around the open yard as if the shadows themselves could come alive. "They're close," she whispered. "I can feel it." Inside the cabin, Elias lit a lantern and set down his hat. The place was humble but sturdy. A single room with rough-hewn walls, a stone fireplace, and shelves lined with old tools and books. Clara's gaze lingered on everything as though memorizing safety itself. "You can take the bed," Elias said, motioning toward the corner. "I'll stay up tonight. We'll figure out our next move come morning." She hesitated. "You shouldn't get involved in this," she said quietly. "These men, Gideon's men, they don't forgive. If they find me here, they'll kill you too." Elias poured water into a tin cup, then met her eyes with a steady calm. "You brought danger to my door, sure, but I reckon it was already headed my way the moment I sent that letter. I invited you here, so whatever's coming, I'll face it." Clara's lip trembled as if she wanted to argue, but the words never came. She sank into the chair near the fire, exhaustion claiming her. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to rest, though her sleep was restless, haunted by the ghosts of the past. While she slept, Elias moved around the cabin methodically, checking every window latch and door hinge. He loaded extra cartridges, set the rifle by the window, and placed his revolver on the table within easy reach. His mind wrestled with what lay ahead. He'd spent years building this quiet life. No family, no debts, no entanglements. But now here was this woman, a stranger who carried death in her shadow and sorrow in her eyes. He could turn her out and save himself. No one would blame him. The frontier had no mercy for fools who carried another's burden. And yet, as he watched her sleeping, curls loose, one hand clutching the blanket like a frightened child, Elias knew he wouldn't send her away. Something about her courage, her pain, stirred the protector in him, the man he'd buried after losing everything years ago. He stepped out onto the porch, the night cool and vast. The valley stretched before him, silent except for the whisper of the wind through the grass. He looked toward the dark tree line and thought he saw a faint glimmer, a reflection, maybe off a rifle barrel. Elias's jaw tightened. "So it begins," he muttered under his breath. When he returned inside, Clara stirred, blinking awake. "Is something wrong?" she asked sleepily. "Nothing we can't handle," he said, forcing a reassuring smile. "But from now on, keep that revolver close. We ain't alone out here." As the fire burned low and the moon rose over the valley, the two of them sat in silence, a rancher and a runaway bound by circumstance and the coming storm. Outside, hidden among the trees, 3 riders watched the cabin, the leader's scarred face twisting into a cruel grin. "Found her," he whispered to the others, "and the fool who took her in." The hunt wasn't over. It had just begun. The following days unfolded in a tense, uneasy rhythm. The Bitterroot Valley was breathtaking in its autumn stillness, golden fields rolling beneath crisp blue skies. But inside Elias Ward's cabin, peace was fragile, always shadowed by the knowledge that danger was near. Elias spent his mornings patrolling the property, checking for tracks or signs of intruders. He found them often: faint hoofprints along the ridge, cigarette butts near the stream, the occasional rustle in the trees that wasn't caused by the wind. Each clue confirmed what both already feared: they were being watched. Inside, Clara tried to keep busy. She mended clothes, swept the floors, and cooked simple meals from what little supplies Elias had. It was her way of clinging to normalcy, to remind herself that life could still hold some gentleness. But the tension was constant, like a storm pressing against the windows. Elias noticed how jumpy she was. If a door creaked, she froze. If the dog barked, her hand instinctively went to the revolver at her hip. Once, when a loose shutter slammed in the wind, she nearly fired. Elias said nothing, but his eyes softened every time she flinched. On the 3rd evening, after a long day repairing the corral fence, he came into the cabin and found her standing by the window, staring into the dark. The sunset had faded to a bruised purple, and her face was pale against the glow. "You see something?" he asked quietly, setting his hat on the table. Clara shook her head, though her fingers twitched nervously. "No, just listening. The silence here is louder than the city." Elias smiled faintly. "You get used to it. Sometimes it's the only company you got." She turned to face him, studying his weathered features. the hard lines carved by wind and years of solitude. "You've been alone a long time," she said softly. He shrugged. "Long enough to forget what a woman's voice sounds like in my house." Clara looked down, her cheeks warming. The tension between them was subtle but real, growing each day they spent under the same roof. Neither dared to name it. It was too soon, too dangerous. But in the quiet moments, when their hands brushed while passing a plate, or their eyes met over the firelight, something wordless began to form between them. That night, as Elias sat sharpening his knife by the fire, Clara broke the silence. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. He looked up. "Regret what?" "Choosing this life. Being so far from everyone and everything." Elias thought for a long time before answering. "Used to. Thought I'd missed my chance at something better. Then I realized peace ain't something you find. It's something you build, one day at a time." Clara's eyes softened. "Even now? With me here, and all this trouble?" He met her gaze. "Even now." For a moment, the fear that clung to her seemed to ease. She smiled, a real, fragile smile, and for the first time since arriving, she looked like someone who might dare to hope again. But the fragile calm shattered not long after. When Elias stepped out to the barn to check the horses, he found something wedged into the wood of the door. A knife, its blade glinting silver under the lantern light. Stuck beneath it was a scrap of paper, crudely written in smudged ink. "You can't hide from love, Clara." Elias's blood ran cold. He scanned the darkness, but there was nothing. No sound, no movement, only the whisper of the wind. Whoever had left it was gone. He pulled the knife free and returned to the cabin, his face grim. Clara looked up from her sewing, her expression immediately changing when she saw his eyes. "What is it?" she asked. He placed the knife and note on the table. "Someone's been here, and I think you know who." Her hand trembled as she unfolded the note. The blood drained from her face. "It's him," she whispered. "Gideon. He's close." Elias's jaw tightened. Then he just made his last mistake. That night, as the fire burned low and the valley sank into darkness, Elias cleaned his rifle and laid out extra ammunition. Clara sat nearby, her hands clasped tightly, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years. Neither of them slept. The silence between them was no longer uneasy. It was the calm before a coming war. Outside, the moon glowed over the distant ridge. In its pale light, a figure on horseback watched the small cabin below, the cruel edge of his smile hidden beneath the shadow of his hat. The night that followed the discovery of the knife was the longest either of them had lived through. Inside the small log cabin, every sound became a warning. The crackle of firewood, the distant hoot of an owl, even the shift of the wind across the grass, all seemed to whisper the same thing. "He's coming." Elias didn't sleep. He sat by the window, his rifle resting across his knees, eyes fixed on the dark tree line that surrounded the ranch. He'd faced danger before, bandits, storms, loneliness. But this was different. This time, it wasn't just his own life at stake. The woman in the next room, the one who had arrived with trembling hands and defiant eyes, had become his responsibility. And something more. Clara stirred restlessly on the cot in the corner. She wasn't used to fear like this, the kind that steals your breath even when you try to stay strong. For so long she had believed she could outrun her past, but Gideon's message proved she was wrong. He wasn't just nearby, he was watching them. When dawn finally broke, Elias stepped outside to check the land. The sky was a thin pink haze, dew still clinging to the grass. He moved quietly, scanning the fence line, the barn, the stream beyond. Then he saw it, hoof prints, fresh and deep, circling the corral and vanishing toward the ridge. He followed them a short way, his hand never leaving the butt of his revolver. But as the trail wound up the hill, the prints disappeared. Whoever had been there knew how to cover his tracks. When Elias returned, Clara was waiting by the door, her face pale and drawn. "Was he here?" she asked in a whisper. Elias hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, he's been watching, but not for long." Her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "I brought this trouble to you," she said. "You should have never—" He cut her off with a quiet firmness. "You didn't bring it. He did. And I'll be damned if I let him take what's mine to protect." Something in his voice steadied her. For the first time since the note appeared, she felt the weight of her fear shift, still there, but no longer crushing her completely. She nodded. "Then we face him together." That day they worked in silence, strengthening the cabin's defenses. Elias reinforced the doors with planks and set traps along the trail. Clara gathered supplies, reloaded ammunition, and brewed coffee so strong it could wake the dead. They barely spoke, but every glance, every shared task, carried a wordless trust. As dusk settled again, the valley turned cold. They sat across from each other at the small wooden table, the lamplight flickering between them. "You ever kill a man?" Clara asked suddenly, her voice steady but low. Elias met her gaze. "Once. Didn't sleep for 3 days after. But I'll do it again if it means keeping you safe." She nodded slowly, then reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You won't be alone this time," she said. For a long moment, neither moved. Outside, the night deepened into silence, the kind that presses down heavy, the kind that makes you listen for footsteps that aren't there. Then came the sound. A faint metallic clink near the barn. Elias was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Clara followed, gripping her revolver tight. He motioned for her to stay behind him, but she shook her head. "No," she mouthed. Together they moved to the door. The barn loomed ahead, a dark shape against the moonlit sky. Another sound, a creak, slow and deliberate. Someone was inside. Elias signaled for Clara to stay by the porch. He crept forward, each step careful, the rifle steady in his hands. The door was slightly ajar. He nudged it open with the barrel. The smell hit first, sweat and smoke. Then movement, a flash of metal. A shadow lunged. Elias fired once, the blast echoing through the valley. The shadow stumbled, cursed, and vanished into the dark. When he turned back, Clara was already running toward him, her eyes wide with fear and fury. "Was it him?" she demanded. Elias stared into the black tree line where the figure had fled. "No," he said grimly. "But it was one of his men." He picked up what the intruder had dropped, a silver pendant, shaped like a snake. Clara gasped when she saw it. "That's Gideon's mark," she whispered. "He's close. Closer than ever." Elias's jaw tightened as he slipped the pendant into his pocket. "Then it's time to stop waiting," he said. "We take the fight to him." The next morning, before the sun rose, Elias and Clara packed their rifles, saddled the horses, and rode toward the ridge, toward the danger that refused to stay hidden. This time, they weren't running. They were hunting. The morning was brittle and cold when Elias and Clara left the safety of the cabin. Mist clung low across the Bitterroot Valley, coiling like pale smoke between the hills. The air carried the metallic scent of rain and danger, the kind that settled deep in a man's bones. Elias rode ahead, scanning the land with the trained eyes of a man who had hunted men before. Every ridge, every hollow told a story, a broken branch, a print in the mud, a faint trail of ashes from a dying campfire. He saw it all, piecing together the route Gideon and his men had taken. Clara followed close behind, her fingers tight around the reins. Though fear still churned in her chest, there was steel in her now, the kind forged in pain and necessity. She no longer looked like the frightened mail-order bride who had arrived by stagecoach. She looked like someone who had chosen to survive, no matter the cost. Hours passed in grim silence. Finally, Elias dismounted near a creek where the grass had been trampled by horses. He crouched low, running his fingers along the mud. 4 men, he said quietly. "Riding hard. They stopped here not long ago." Clara knelt beside him. "Then they're still close," he nodded. "Close enough to smell the smoke from their camp." They followed the trail deeper into the hills until the scent of burning wood and stew reached them. From a bluff overlooking the valley, they saw the camp, 3 horses tethered by a fallen tree, a fire smoldering, and 2 men laughing over a tin pot. The third figure sat apart, cleaning a revolver. Even from that distance, Clara recognized the dark coat, the rigid posture. Gideon. Her breath caught. Memories hit like a blow. The night he'd locked her in a cellar for defying him, the look in his eyes when he promised she'd never escape. Rage, sharp and clear, cut through her fear. Elias studied her face. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked quietly. "There's no going back once we start." She met his gaze, her jaw set. "I was dead the moment I married him. This is me coming back to life." That was all he needed to hear. Elias laid out the plan in a whisper. Quick, efficient, the way soldiers talk before battle. They would wait until dusk, circle the ridge, and take them by surprise. Clara would cover him from above, her rifle trained on the firelight below. When the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in bruised reds and golds, they moved. Every step was soundless, every heartbeat loud. The wind shifted, carrying Gideon's voice, smooth, taunting, unaware of what was coming. Elias reached the edge of the clearing and crouched behind a fallen log. He gave a low whistle. The signal. In a flash, chaos erupted. Elias burst from the shadows, rifle raised, firing once. The first man dropped instantly. The second spun toward the sound, cursing, but Clara's shot cracked through the air and sent him sprawling backward into the fire. Gideon ducked behind a rock, firing back with deadly precision. Bullets tore through branches and dirt. "Clara!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the clearing. "You think that rancher can save you? He'll die just like the rest!" Clara's heart pounded. She could see him clearly now, his eyes wild, his mouth twisted into that familiar cruel grin. The man who had haunted her nightmares was right there, alive and sneering. Elias moved closer, crouched behind a tree, waiting for a clear shot. But Gideon was cunning. He shifted, firing in bursts, forcing Elias to stay down. Then, in a flash of movement, Gideon threw something. A lantern. It shattered near Elias and flames leapt across the grass. "Elias!" Clara cried, scrambling down the hill. Smoke filled the clearing as fire spread, turning the dry grass into a ring of heat and chaos. Through the haze, Elias rose, coughing, eyes stinging. He saw Gideon running toward his horse. Without hesitation, he fired, the bullet grazing Gideon's shoulder, spinning him around. Gideon fell, rolled, and scrambled to his feet, blood on his sleeve but fury blazing in his eyes. "You should have stayed out of this, rancher!" he roared. Elias didn't answer. He just leveled his rifle. But before he could fire again, Clara stepped forward, her revolver raised, her voice trembling but sure. "No, Elias, he's mine." The fire crackled between them, casting their faces in gold and shadow. Gideon's smirk faltered when he saw her eyes. Steady, unbroken, no longer afraid. He laughed once, bitterly. "You wouldn't—" Her shot cut him off. One clean shot straight through the chest. Gideon stumbled, fell to his knees, and collapsed into the dirt. The valley went silent, save for the hiss of burning grass. Clara lowered her gun slowly, her breath shaking. Elias stepped beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly, but she knew it wasn't. Not yet. The past doesn't die with a bullet. It lingers, waiting to be buried for good. They watched the flames consume the camp, the fire erasing every trace of what had been. When it was done, Elias took her hand, their fingers lacing together in the orange glow. "Let's go home," he said. And for the first time in years, the word home didn't sound like a prison to her. It sounded like peace. The fire burned long into the night, painting the hills with a dim orange glow. By dawn, only smoldering ashes remained, the last traces of Gideon and the violence he'd brought with him. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and rain-soaked earth. Clara stood beside Elias in silence, her eyes fixed on the charred clearing below. It should have felt like victory. Gideon was gone. His men were scattered or dead. The nightmare that had haunted her for years had finally ended. Yet as the morning wind carried the last threads of smoke into the sky, Clara felt something else, a strange, aching emptiness. Elias noticed it too. He didn't speak right away. He just watched her, the way her fingers trembled slightly at her sides, the way her face held both strength and sorrow. "You did what you had to," he said at last, his voice low, roughened by smoke and exhaustion. Clara nodded, though her throat tightened. I know, I just thought it would feel different. Killing a man never feels clean, Elias said, even when he deserves it. For a while, neither spoke. The valley was eerily quiet. No birds, no wind, just the slow crackle of dying embers. Finally, Elias touched her arm. Let's go home. We'll bury what's left and be done with it. They worked in silence, digging shallow graves where the ground was soft. Clara refused to look away as the earth covered Gideon's face. It wasn't forgiveness, it was closure. When the last shovelful of dirt fell, she whispered something Elias couldn't quite hear. A prayer, maybe, or a goodbye. The ride back to the ranch was slow and heavy. Rain began to fall, first in small drops, then harder, washing the soot from their clothes and skin. The land seemed to breathe again, as if the valley itself had been holding its breath through the violence and was now exhaling in relief. When they finally reached the cabin, the familiar creak of the porch boards and the smell of pine brought a wave of unexpected comfort. Elias dismounted first, helping Clara down. You need rest, he said. You've been through hell. I'll rest when the shaking stops, she said with a faint, weary smile. He chuckled softly, leading her inside. The fire in the hearth was long dead, so he knelt to light it again. The flickering glow soon filled the small room, chasing away the chill. Clara stood by the window watching the rain streak down the glass. I keep seeing his face, she whispered. Even when I close my eyes. Elias looked up from the fire. It'll fade. Not fast, but it will. You just gotta give it time. She turned to him then. Really looked at him. The lines of worry etched around his eyes, the soot smeared across his shirt, the exhaustion written in every movement. Yet beneath it all there was something else. Strength, steadfastness, the kind of presence that made the world feel safe again. Why did you help me, Elias? She asked quietly. You didn't owe me anything. He met her gaze, his expression soft but serious. Maybe I didn't, he said. But I reckon I was tired of living like the world don't need saving. You showed up, and I guess I remembered what it's like to care again. Her breath caught. No one had ever said something like that to her, not without wanting something in return. She stepped closer, the firelight flickering between them. I don't know how to thank you, she said. You already did, he murmured. Silence stretched, thick and full. Then Clara did something neither expected. She reached up and touched his face, brushing the soot from his cheek. His hand came up, covering hers. For the first time since she'd arrived, there was no fear in her eyes, only warmth. But before the moment could deepen, thunder rolled across the valley. Elias's expression hardened again, instinctively scanning the windows. Old habits died hard. Storm's moving in, he said. We'll need to make sure the horses are sheltered. Clara smiled faintly. Always thinking ahead. It's the only reason I'm still alive, he replied with a half grin. They spent the rest of the evening working side by side, checking the barn and securing the gates against the coming rain. For the first time, they worked not out of fear, but out of rhythm, two people learning to move as one. When they finally returned to the cabin, soaked and shivering, Elias poured them each a cup of strong coffee. Clara sat beside him by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes reflecting the flames. Outside, the rain beat steady on the roof, a cleansing, endless rhythm. Inside, the air was filled with quiet peace. Clara took a deep breath, leaning back in her chair. It's strange, she said softly. After everything that's happened, it finally feels like I can breathe again. Elias looked at her, his eyes steady and warm. Then maybe that's where we start, he said. Right here, just breathing. And in that simple moment, the fire crackling, the rain falling, two souls scarred but still standing, they found the first fragile hint of something new. Not survival, not vengeance. The days after Gideon's death passed quietly, as if the land itself was trying to heal. The valley that had once echoed with gunfire now lay calm under the soft rhythm of autumn rain. For the first time since she arrived, Clara woke without fear in her chest. Each morning she found herself listening not for footsteps or threats, but for the steady, grounding sounds of life, the creak of the barn, the cluck of hens, and Elias's low voice humming as he worked outside. Life began to take on a gentle routine. Elias split firewood at dawn while Clara prepared breakfast, her movements sure and graceful despite the shadows that still lingered in her eyes. She tended the garden, patched the torn curtains, and even dared to hum sometimes while she cooked. Elias would watch her quietly, his heart caught somewhere between admiration and protectiveness. But beneath that peace lay something neither spoke of, the weight of what they had survived, and the uncertainty of what came next. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, Elias returned from town with supplies. Clara met him at the gate, her hands dusted with flour. "You were gone longer than usual," she said, a hint of worry in her tone. "Had some talking to do," he replied, lifting a sack of grain onto his shoulder. Her brow furrowed. "Talking to who?" He hesitated, then said, "Sheriff Miller." Words spread about what happened. "About Gideon." Clara froze. "What did you tell him?" "The truth," Elias said simply. "That Gideon came here looking for you. That we tried to stop him. That it was self-defense." She swallowed hard. "And he believed you?" Elias set the sack down, his expression unreadable. "He did. Said Gideon had warrants in 3 states. "They'll call it justice served." Clara exhaled shakily, relief washing over her. "Then, it's really over." Elias nodded. "It's over." Yet even as he said it, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. He'd seen too much of the world to believe peace came without a price. That night, as they sat by the fire, Clara stared into the flames, her thoughts far away. "Do you ever think we can go back?" she asked softly. "To what life was before all this?" Elias looked at her, his rough hands resting on his knees. "Can't go back," he said. "But maybe we can make something better," she smiled faintly. "Better sounds nice." He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. "I got something for you." From the folds of his coat, he pulled out a small, polished wooden box. Inside lay a silver locket, simple, elegant, its surface engraved with a sprig of wild sage. Clara gasped softly, her hand trembling as she touched it. "Elias, it's beautiful. It belonged to my ma," he said. "She used to say it kept her brave when times got hard. Reckon you've earned it more than anyone I know." Emotion welled in her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Don't gotta say nothing," he murmured. "Just promise me you'll stay. This place, it ain't much without you." Her breath caught. "You want me to stay?" "I want you to want to stay," he said, his voice steady but gentle. "You don't owe me anything, Clara. You could go east, start fresh. No one'd blame you." She looked at him for a long moment, the firelight dancing across her face. Then she shook her head. "No, I've been running my whole life, Elias, but here, with you, I finally stopped. I think this is where I belong." He smiled then, a small, quiet thing that spoke more than words could. "Then I reckon I'm the luckiest man in Montana." For the first time, laughter came easily between them. They ate dinner by the fire, talking about crops, horses, and the coming winter, the kind of simple talk that feels like safety. Later, when the lamps were low, Clara stepped outside. The rain had stopped, and the valley shimmered under a canopy of stars. The air was cool, smelling faintly of pine and smoke. Elias joined her, standing close enough that their shoulders brushed. "Cold?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. He wrapped his coat around her without a word. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence was warm now, not heavy, the kind that belongs to two people who no longer need to hide their hearts. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. "You know what I realized tonight?" "What's that?" "I think peace isn't something that just happens," she said softly. "It's something you build, one day at a time." Elias smiled at that, his arm tightening around her. "Sounds like something I'd say." "Maybe I'm starting to think like you," she teased. "Careful," he drawled, grinning. "That's a dangerous habit." The stars burned bright above them, and for the first time in years, Clara felt completely unafraid. The valley, once filled with shadows and blood, had become their sanctuary, And though the world beyond still held its dangers, for now, in that quiet moment under the endless Montana sky, they had peace and each other. Winter crept slowly into the Bitterroot Valley, bringing with it long nights, biting winds, and a hush that blanketed the land in white. For Elias and Clara, the snow felt like a kind of grace, a fresh beginning covering the scars of the past. Yet beneath the calm beauty of the season, both knew that true peace required more than quiet days. It required trust, healing, and the courage to dream again. By December, the cabin had transformed. Where once it had felt cold and lonely, now it glowed with warmth. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, a quilt Clara had sewn covered the bed, and the faint scent of baked bread drifted through the air. Life had taken root again. Elias had begun fixing up the barn, talking about expanding the herd come spring. Clara helped him with the ledgers, her once shaking hands now steady. Sometimes she caught herself smiling for no reason, a small miracle in itself. But healing, like the Montana winter, came in fits and starts. Some nights, she still woke gasping from dreams of Gideon, his voice, his rage, the cold grip of his control. When she did, she'd slip from bed quietly, standing by the window as snow fell like ghosts outside. One such night, Elias stirred and saw her silhouette outlined in moonlight. Without a word, he rose and stood beside her. "Dreams again?" he asked softly. She nodded, arms wrapped around herself. "Sometimes it feels like he's still out there waiting. Like I'll never really be free." Elias's gaze was steady. "You are free, Clara. The dead don't get to own you anymore." She turned toward him then, her eyes wet but fierce. "And what about you, Elias? You talk like you've buried all your ghosts, but I see it. The way you look at the horizon. Like there's something out there you're still fighting." He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Used to be. Spent years thinking the land owed me something for what it took. My brother, my peace. Truth is, I was just too damn stubborn to let go." Clara stepped closer. "And now?" He smiled faintly. "Now I got a reason to stay put." She reached for his hand, fingers cold but sure. "Then maybe we can both learn to stop looking backward." He squeezed her hand gently. "Maybe we already are." From that night on, something between them changed. Their bond, once built from survival and fear, began to grow roots of its own. Quiet, deep, and strong. Clara no longer saw Elias only as her protector. He was her partner, her equal. The man who had stood beside her when she had nothing left to give. One morning, after a heavy snowfall, Elias found her outside, bundled in furs, building a small wooden fence near the garden. "You planning to farm in the snow?" he teased. She laughed, the sound light, genuine. "No, I'm planning ahead. Come spring, I want to plant something that lasts. Wild sage, maybe? Sage." She smiled, brushing snow from her gloves. "It survives the hardest winters. I like that about it." Elias watched her, warmth spreading through him in spite of the cold. "Then we'll plant it together." As the days passed, their small world filled with small acts of care. Laughter over morning coffee, quiet evenings by the fire, shared stories that softened the silence. Yet even as peace settled deeper into their lives, change was stirring on the horizon. One afternoon, a rider appeared, a messenger from town. He brought letters, one for Elias from a cattle buyer in Helena, and one for Clara, marked with a delicate seal. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter from the orphanage in St. Louis, the place where she'd once dreamed of working before her life was stolen by Gideon. The letter was kind, offering her a position come spring. She read it twice, then looked up at Elias. "They want me to come back, to help teach the children." He said nothing for a long time. Finally, he nodded. "That's good news. Means they still remember you." Her heart ached at the distance in his voice. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "Part of me wants to go. To finish what I started, but part of you's found something here." He finished quietly. She nodded. "Yes." He looked at her then, his blue eyes unreadable. "You don't owe me your stay, Clara. You've got your own road." If that road leads east, I won't stop you. Tears pricked her eyes, but she smiled softly. You wouldn't have to. But I think I've got one more winter here to figure it out. Elias smiled faintly, tipping his hat. Then we'll make it a good one. That night, as snow fell heavy outside and the fire burned low, Clara placed the letter beside the locket he'd given her. 2 symbols, one of her past, one of her new beginning, and as the wind howled softly against the cabin walls, she whispered into the dark, Maybe freedom isn't running. Maybe it's choosing where you stay. Elias, half asleep nearby, heard her words and smiled, because deep down, he already knew she had chosen. Spring returned to the Bitterroot Valley like a slow exhale, melting the last of winter's ice and painting the world in soft shades of green. The mountains glistened with thawing snow, the rivers sang louder, and the fields shimmered with life. For Clara and Elias, the season felt like a quiet awakening, not just for the land, but for their hearts. The letter from St. Louis still sat on the mantel, unopened since the day she placed it there beside Elias's locket. She hadn't yet decided what it meant or what she was supposed to do. But she'd realized something in the months since. Sometimes answers didn't come in words. They came in moments, shared glances, quiet laughter, the slow building of something worth staying for. Elias had been busy repairing the southern fence and clearing new pasture. His movements were sure, steady, and filled with purpose. Clara often joined him, her skirts tucked up as she carried tools or fetched water. Together they worked the land as equals, the rhythm of their lives finally settling into peace. One morning, Elias came in from the barn with a letter of his own, this one from the cattle buyer in Helena. He placed it on the table, the edges smudged with dirt. They're offering to buy the herd, he said quietly. Enough to pay off the debt and start fresh. Clara set down her cup, eyes meeting his. Start fresh where? He hesitated. Was thinking, maybe up north. Fertile land, fewer neighbors. Could build something new there. Her breath caught. You mean, leave the valley? He looked at her long and hard. I ain't saying we have to, just seems like you might want a new start too, away from everything that reminds you of before. Clara glanced toward the window where the sun touched the horizon and a pair of deer moved through the meadow. Elias, I used to think running meant freedom. But now I know. Freedom's in standing still long enough to grow roots. He smiled faintly. You sure about that? She nodded. I am. This land's seen our worst and our best. It's where I found myself again, where I found you. I don't want to start over somewhere else. I want to keep building here. He studied her for a long moment, the lines around his eyes softening. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small and wrapped in cloth. Then maybe this belongs here too. When he opened it, Clara gasped. A simple silver band worn smooth from years of keeping. This was my mother's, he said quietly. She used to say it carried more than a promise. It carried the will to keep one. Clara's voice trembled. Elias? I ain't a man of fancy words, he said, stepping closer. But I know this much. When you came here, I was half alive, angry at the world. Then you walked into my cabin and turned it into a home. I can't promise you an easy life, Clara, but I can promise to stand beside you through every storm that comes. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at him, her heart swelling with a quiet certainty she'd never felt before. Then I promised to stay, not because I have to, but because I want to. He slipped the ring gently onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Outside, the valley came alive, the first blossoms opening, the river glinting like silver beneath the rising sun. That evening, as they stood on the porch watching the light fade across the pines, Clara leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you think we deserve all this peace after everything? She asked softly. Elias smiled, his arm around her. Peace ain't something you're given. It's something you build, and I reckon we've earned it. In the quiet that followed, the world seemed to hold its breath. The land that had once been scarred by pain now echoed with renewal. The cabin that had been a refuge was now a home. Later, as dusk deepened into night, Clara looked toward the mantel where the letter from St. Louis still rested. With a steady hand, she took it down, folded it carefully, and fed it to the fire. Elias watched as the paper curled and burned, the flames consuming the last ties to her past. "No more running," she whispered. He nodded. "No more running." As the stars emerged over the valley, the two stood in silence, not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as partners bound by choice. And when the wind passed softly through the pines, it carried with it the faintest whisper, like the echo of her first words months ago, now transformed. "We're alone now," she'd once said in fear. Now she said it again, not as a warning, but as a promise. "We're alone now, Elias, and that's enough." In that stillness, beneath the endless Montana sky, they knew their story, forged by loss, built on trust, and sealed by love, had finally come full circle. They were home. Forever.